What did medieval executioners do when they weren't executing? Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back into the hazy, not so glamorous world of medieval Europe. So go ahead and dim the lights, fix your pillows, and maybe pour yourself a cup of something warm. You won't need your full brain power for this one. Just let me ramble in your ear for a while about one of history's strangest professions, the medieval executioner. Because yes, these people really existed. They had names, they had neighbors, and they had to buy bread just like everyone else. They didn't just pop out of the shadows with an axe, swing a few times, and then vanish into the fog. They had bills, chores, maybe a spouse complaining about the laundry. And if you're wondering, no, their lives were not glamorous. They were awkward, lonely, and very, very weird, which makes them perfect bedtime material. So, what did an executioner do when he wasn't executing? Well, a lot of things. Some of them pretty normal, like farming or drinking too much ale. Some of them depressing, like being shunned in church. And some of them so ironic that you almost have to laugh. Like the fact that executioners often doubled as healers. Yes, the guy who chopped off your cousin's head might also be the one setting your broken leg the next day. Because medieval logic was basically, a sharp blade is a sharp blade. Close enough. But let's take it slow. Executioners in medieval Europe were, to put it mildly, socially awkward. Nobody really wanted to hang out with them. You might shake their hand if you had to, but then you'd probably wipe it on your tunic. They were considered unclean, not just because of the whole blood-splashing thing, but also because the church sort of frowned on the profession. Officially, killing people was God's business. Unofficially, the state still needed someone to swing the sword, so executioners lived in this grey area. Necessary but shameful, and that meant most towns treated them like garbage, literally. Executioners were often required to live just outside the city walls. Sometimes their houses were marked with a symbol so everyone would know, oh, that's the guy who hangs people. Don't invite him to the harvest festival. Children were told not to play near them. Bakers might refuse to sell them bread. And of course, no one wanted to marry into the family. Imagine being the daughter of the town executioner on medieval Tinder. Swipe left again. So what did these guys do with their time? Well, first of all, they usually had a side hustle. Contrary to popular belief, execution was not a full-time job. Heads didn't roll every day. Some towns might go months without a single official punishment. So unless you wanted your executioner to sit around sharpening his axe in boredom, you had to give him something else to do. One common side gig. Garbage. Disposal? Yep. The same guy who handled the condemned criminal might also handle your town's literal trash. Which makes sense in a twisted way. You're already the social outcast. Why not pile on another unpleasant job? So executioners sometimes cleaned latrines, dragged away animal carcasses, or cleared out the smelly remains from the butcher's quarter. Basically, they were medieval sanitation workers, only with more blood on their resume. And speaking of butchers, executioners often were butchers. It's a logical career overlap. If you know how to chop up a cow without ruining the meat, you know how to chop up, well, let's just say other things. Many executioners actually came from butcher families. Some were literally trained in slaughterhouses before they took up the sword professionally. It's a family trade like blacksmithing, but with a bit more trauma. But here's the fun twist. While executioners were shunned socially, people still needed them in private. Because, ironically, executioners were sometimes considered the best people to go to for medicine. Don't ask me why medieval logic works this way, but it does. Maybe it was the access to bodies, maybe it was their knowledge of anatomy, or maybe it was just that when you've already been branded unclean, Cutting someone open to remove a tumor doesn't make your reputation much worse. There are records of executioners selling body parts as medicine. Like, here, rub this powdered hand bone on your arthritis, it'll help. Or they'd keep jars of fat from executed criminals, which was considered great for treating wounds. Again, medieval Europe, not exactly the Mayo Clinic. But the really weird part is that people bought this stuff. They might cross the street to avoid the executioner in daylight, but at night they'd knock on his door for ointment made from someone's cousin. And then there's the healing itself. Some executioners got a reputation as surprisingly decent. Surgeons? They could set broken bones, stitch up cuts, and even perform crude amputations. Because when you think about it, the guy had steady hands. He knew how to handle blades. And honestly, if you needed someone to saw off your gangrenous foot, you probably weren't picky. Executioners also had the charming duty of torturer. Because of course they did. Who else was going to handle that? If the court needed someone to question a prisoner, and by question we mean stretch them on the rack until they confessed, the executioner was the go-to guy. This meant their daily routine could include sharpening thumb screws in the morning, breaking someone's legs in the afternoon, and then buying onions at the market on the way home. Very normal work-life balance. And yet despite all this, executioners weren't always hated. Some became weirdly popular. If they were skilled, and by skilled I mean they could deliver a quick, clean beheading without making a mess, people respected them. Because nothing ruined a public execution like 3 failed swings of the sword. So a smooth executioner could win a strange kind of admiration. Not friendship exactly, but grudging respect. Like, okay, he killed that guy. Really efficiently. Well done. Still, you didn't want to be their neighbor. Executioners were often banned from entering certain trades. They couldn't join guilds. They weren't welcome at churches. Their kids had trouble getting apprenticeships. It was basically hereditary social exile, which is why many executioner families just kept being executioners. Once your father was one, you didn't have much chance of escaping it. Congratulations, son. You'll also be hated by everyone you meet. Now let's wander into the lighter side for a moment, because executioners had hobbies too. Some drank a lot. Ale was cheap, and if your day job involved heads and ropes, you probably needed something to take the edge off. Some gambled, hanging out with other social outcasts like gravediggers and night watchmen. And some executioners just quietly tended gardens because why not? You might be the most feared man in town, but you still need cabbages. Of course, romance was tricky. Executioners often married other outcasts, like prostitutes, widows, or the children of criminals. Sometimes towns actually forced criminals to marry executioners as punishment. Imagine stealing a loaf of bread and ending up with a husband whose weekend plan is burn someone at the stake. Truly, medieval matchmaking was brutal, and yet families formed. Children grew up with fathers who doubled as the local killer and healer. Some kids even took pride in it. Others, not so much. Records suggest that daughters of executioners had trouble finding husbands. Shocking, I know. But sons often just carried on the business. It was the medieval version of nepotism, only with more decapitation. So, when executioners weren't executing, they were busy doing everything no one else wanted to do. They cleaned, they tortured, they healed, they sold weird folk medicine, they gambled, they gardened. They were useful, despised, sometimes respected, but never quite accepted. Which makes them a fascinating reminder that even the darkest jobs in history came with grocery lists, family dinners, and side hustles. But we're just getting started. Let's float over now to some real executioners by name, because believe it or not, we actually know a few of their personal stories, and they're every bit as awkward as you'd expect. The awkward celebrity executioners. So now that we've set the stage with the general day-to-day weirdness of executioners, let's drift towards some actual names. Because yes, medieval and early modern Europe left us with records. Not just vague mentions of the hangman, but actual family histories. Which is kind of amazing, considering most people wanted nothing to do with them. One of the most famous examples comes from Nuremberg in the 1500s, a man named Franz Schmidt, better known, rather dramatically, as Meister Franz, which sounds like a magician's stage name, but really it was just his job title. Franz is interesting for a few reasons. For one, he kept a diary. Because why not? If you're chopping off heads and breaking people on the wheel, might as well write it down for posterity. His diary has survived, and it's one of the best windows we have into the daily life of an executioner. Spoiler, it's not glamorous, it's basically, on Tuesday I executed 3 thieves, on Wednesday I cut off someone's ear, on Thursday I made soup. Very flat, very practical, which makes it weirdly soothing to read. But here's the wild thing. Meister Franz wasn't even supposed to be an executioner. His father had been forced into the role. Apparently the family got caught up in a shady deal with a local noble, and as punishment, Dad was made the town's official executioner. Because in medieval logic, you wronged me, now your descendants will handle all the beheadings forever. Seems fair. So poor little Franz grew up with no real choice. Society wouldn't let him do anything else. But unlike many executioners, he actually leaned into it. He got very good at the job. He kept meticulous records, and he even became known as unusually compassionate, which is an odd reputation for a man who literally killed people for a living. But in his notes you can see it. He treated prisoners with a certain dignity. He prayed with them. He made sure their deaths were quick. He wanted to be seen not as a monster, but as a professional. Outside executions, Franz also did what a lot of executioners did. He worked as a healer. Remember that overlap? Yeah. He became well known in Nuremberg for his medical skills, setting bones, stopping bleeding, treating infections. People avoided him in public, but behind closed doors, they absolutely came knocking when they needed help. By the end of his career, he had almost 1,000 medical cases recorded. Imagine being known as both the guy who chops off heads and the guy who heals headaches. Now, Franz wasn't unique. Executioner dynasties were a thing. Families where generation after generation inherited the axe, the rope, and the social stigma. It was the one job you didn't want to inherit, but once it stuck, you were basically doomed. Take the Sanson family of France. Their story stretches across centuries, from the 1600s into the French Revolution. If the name rings a faint bell, it's probably because Charles-Henri Sanson became notorious as the man who executed Louis XVI. You know, the king who lost his head in 1793. Very famous moment, very awkward job. But Charles-Henri wasn't just some random guy pulled off the street. He came from 6 generations of executioners. The Sansons were basically France's first family of professional killing. They had their own techniques, their own pride in precision, and, oddly, their own social standing. Because in Paris, the job was too big to ignore. If you're going to execute royalty, you might as well do it cleanly. Charles-Henri himself was a strange figure. Polite, educated, soft-spoken, the kind of man you could picture sipping tea and reading poetry, and then calmly leading you to the guillotine. He hated his job, or so he said, but he did it anyway, because family duty. because someone had to, and because the French state wasn't about to let him open a bakery instead. What's eerie about the Sansons is how normal they tried to seem. They dressed well, they had nice homes, they wanted to be accepted in society. But at the end of the day, everyone knew what their real business was. It was a paradox, feared and necessary, yet constantly excluded. Let's float back a bit earlier, though, to the Middle Ages proper. Executioners weren't just family men and reluctant professionals. Sometimes they were also outright celebrities. Well, in the way medieval celebrities existed. In some towns, the executioner had a recognizable outfit, maybe a red coat or a special hat. Everyone knew who they were. Sometimes their houses had a symbol carved on the door, and occasionally people would show up just to talk to them out of curiosity. Because nothing makes a person more fascinating than being both hated and forbidden. There are stories of executioners being invited to taverns, only to have everyone scatter when they walked in. But then, later that night, someone would sneak over with a drink because, hey, maybe the executioner has stories. And oh, did they? You don't exactly get through 30 years of executions without a few colorful memories. But here's the thing. Executioners weren't supposed to brag. They weren't supposed to enjoy it. Their job was considered a grim civic duty, which meant publicly they had to stay humble, quiet, and professional. Privately, who knows? Maybe they joked about how many swings it took. Maybe they compared rope brands. It's the kind of gallows humor we'll never really hear in full detail, but you know it was there. Now let's wander briefly into the religious angle, because executioners lived in a weird spiritual limbo. Technically, the church condemned killing, but execution was considered a legal necessity. So priests didn't quite know what to do with the hangman. Some wouldn't let him take communion. Others made him sit in a separate pew. And in certain towns, priests outright refused to bury executioners in consecrated ground, which meant entire executioner cemeteries sprang up on the margins. A whole neighborhood of professional pariahs, right down to the grave. Despite this, many executioners considered themselves devout. Franz Schmidt, for example, wrote about praying with prisoners before their deaths. He saw it as part of the job, a final mercy. Executioners weren't sadists, at least not usually. They wanted to be seen as impartial servants of justice, which is oddly touching when you think about it. So when we talk about what executioners did outside of work, the answer is layered. Some drank away the stigma. Some tended gardens and raised families. Some became quasi-doctors. Some became legends. And some, like the Sansons, managed to straddle the line between despised outcasts and essential public figures. It's a bizarre contradiction. Executioners were necessary, but unwanted. Skilled, but shunned. Hated in daylight. Needed in secret. Which made their lives quietly tragic and quietly fascinating. And we're only halfway into their world. In the next stretch, let's float into their actual daily routines in more detail. What they ate, how they shopped, and how they raised their kids in towns that wanted nothing to do with them. Because yes, someone had to explain to little medieval Timmy why no one would sit next to him at school. Shopping, supper, and social stigma. So, we've talked about executioners as professionals, and we've peeked into a few family dynasties. But let's slow things down a bit and imagine what their actual day-to-day looked like. Because again, these people weren't supernatural monsters. They had to eat, sleep, and raise children just like everybody else. The difference was, society never let them forget their job. Picture it. You're the town executioner in, say, 14th century Germany. It's a normal Tuesday. No one's scheduled to lose their head today. but you still need to buy bread, which means walking into the market, where everyone pretends not to see you. Vendors suddenly get very busy polishing apples or rearranging cabbages. The fishmonger looks the other way. And eventually, someone reluctantly sells you a loaf of rye while making the sign of the cross under the table and the cherry on top. You usually had to pay more. Some merchants charged executioners double. Because, hey, what are you going to do is complain? You're already living in a house marked with a literal hangman's sign. There's not a medieval better business. Bureau to take your case. So many executioners ended up growing their own food. Small gardens outside the town walls, a few chickens, maybe a pig or two. It wasn't glamorous, but it meant fewer awkward stares at the bakery. And honestly, if you were already banned from most social events, you had plenty of time to water. The cabbages. Family life was another challenge. Executioners usually married within the margins. Daughters of other executioners, prostitutes, widows, or women from disgraced families. Basically, people who already had little to lose in terms of social standing. And children, well, they inherited the stigma whether they liked it or not. There are records of executioners' kids being bullied in schools, shunned by apprenticeships, and outright banned from joining guilds. Imagine trying to become a blacksmith when the guildmaster says, "Sorry, your dad hangs people. Go hammer something else." So many kids just followed the family trade, not because they wanted to, but because no one else would have them. It became a cycle. One generation of executioners breeding the next, creating these strange dynasties of permanent outsiders. Of course, there were exceptions. A few lucky children escaped by marrying into distant villages where their past wasn't known. But mostly, if your dad swung the sword, your career options were pretty limited. What do you want to be when you grow up, son? Literally anything else. Too bad. Meals were probably normal, which almost makes it sadder. You sit down to a stew of barley and beans while your wife reminds you to wash the blood off your boots before bed. Children arguing about chores, chickens clucking outside. The rhythm of a perfectly ordinary medieval household, except the father's office involves gallows. And let's talk about housing. Executioners were usually forced to live on the edge of town. Sometimes their houses were literally built next to the gallows, like a grim version of company housing. You can imagine how awkward it was to invite guests. Come on over. Ignore the dangling corpse outside. We'll have stew. Needless to say, they didn't host many dinner parties. Even in towns where they lived closer in, their homes were marked. Some places painted a red hand on the door, or carved a gallows symbol into the wood, a handy way for everyone to avoid accidentally knocking. It's almost comical, like putting up a neon sign saying, "Yes, this is the creepy house." Now, despite being outcasts, executioners weren't completely invisible. People gossiped about them constantly. Imagine the local tavern chatter. "Did you see the way the hangman's wife bought 2 chickens today? Must be planning something." People loved speculating about executioners' private lives, partly out of fear, partly out of boredom. There are even records of townsfolk sneaking into executioner homes out of morbid curiosity. Like, "I just want to see what his kitchen looks like." Spoiler, it looked like everyone else's kitchen, only with a slightly higher chance of having a random torture device tucked in the corner. Which, yes, some executioners did keep at home. Medieval multitasking. And then there's the question of friendships. Could executioners have them? Sort of. Usually they befriended other outsiders, gravediggers, lepers, prostitutes, or low-level criminals. Basically the social equivalent of the kids' table at a wedding. Sometimes these friendships were genuine, sometimes just convenient. Because, When everyone else shuns you, you take what you can get. One of the strangest parts of executioner life was how their work blurred with superstition. Remember how they sold medicine from executed bodies? Well, that extended into their social reputation. Some people thought executioners had magical powers, a kind of spooky aura, as if handling death so often gave them special insight. So while most avoided them, a few actually sought them out. Not just for broken bones, but for charms, cures, or advice. Imagine having the most feared man in town also be your local witch doctor. Again, medieval Europe. Logic was optional, and this weird superstition sometimes gave executioners leverage. They might be despised, but they weren't powerless. If you crossed them, you risked more than just social awkwardness. Because who's going to believe you over the guy with the state's axe? Exactly. Let's not forget their downtime. When executioners weren't busy, they had hobbies like anyone else. Gambling was common. Drinking, too. Some played dice in taverns with the only people who would sit near them. Others developed more domestic skills. Gardening, carpentry, even writing. Yes, writing. Franz Schmidt's diary proves that at least some executioners were literate, thoughtful, and meticulous. He didn't just record executions, he recorded his feelings about them, which makes him come across less like a heartless killer and more like a weary civil servant. Imagine a medieval version of an office worker complaining about paperwork. Today I beheaded a thief. It was fine, I suppose. Tomorrow I will set a bone, must remember to water the cabbages. It's oddly humanizing, which is maybe the point. Executioners weren't monsters. They were trapped in a profession no one wanted but everyone needed. And outside of that role, they were just people trying to live. So when we ask what executioners did when they weren't executing, the answer is often the same things as everyone else. Cooking meals, raising kids, arguing with their spouses, only with an added layer of constant social rejection. Imagine living in a town where every time you walked down the street, people crossed themselves and turned away. That was their reality. And yet they endured. Families survived. Generations carried on. The work continued, grimly, endlessly, until executioners finally faded out of the picture with the rise of modern prisons and new ideas about punishment. But we're not done drifting yet. Next, let's float over to some of the stranger duties they picked up on the side. Because chopping heads wasn't the only thing on their job description. Sometimes they executed animals, sometimes they staged elaborate public punishments, and sometimes their role was so bizarre you almost wonder if the town council was messing with them. Strange jobs, stranger justice. So we've settled in with executioners at home. We've peeked at their gardens, their awkward market trips, their kids dealing with medieval bullying. But when they did get called to work, it wasn't always just swinging an axe. Sometimes their professional duties veered into the surreal. Because medieval justice was nothing if not creative. Let's start with one of the strangest traditions, animal executions. Yes, this was a thing. In medieval Europe, animals could be put on trial. A pig that killed a child, straight to court. A cow that trampled someone, summoned before a judge. Sometimes entire swarms of insects were excommunicated for eating crops. It sounds like parody. But the records are there, written in solemn Latin, and when the verdict came down, who else but the executioner would carry it out? Imagine a very serious man in a red coat, dragging a squealing pig to the gallows, while townsfolk nod solemnly. As though justice is being served, pigs were the most common culprits. They roamed freely through medieval towns, snuffling at garbage, occasionally knocking over toddlers. And because people couldn't just shrug and say accidents happen, they made examples of them. So yes, pigs were hanged, sometimes even dressed in little clothes to symbolize their crime, because apparently medieval Europe thought, let's make this horrifying and theatrical. Executioners handled these jobs like any other, leading an animal to the scaffold, putting the noose in place and getting the job done. Not exactly in the training manual, but hey, work is work. Beyond animals, executioners were also tasked with weird public punishments. Think less swift death and more extended humiliation. Branding, for example. Criminals might have letters burned into their skin, a T for thief, or a B for bandit. Who got to handle the hot iron? Yep, our friend the executioner. There was ear cropping too. Slice off the top of someone's ear and let them wander around town as a walking warning label. Sometimes noses, sometimes whole fingers. Again, executioner, territory. And then there were the parades. Punishment often had a theatrical element. Criminals marched through the streets with signs around their necks or strapped into stocks where the public could jeer and throw rotten vegetables. The executioner was basically the stage manager, making sure the humiliation went smoothly. Imagine wrangling a parade of criminals while also keeping an eye out for teenagers trying to sneak in a few extra tomatoes. Another favorite medieval punishment? The pillory. You know, the wooden contraption where your head and hands stick out. Great for immobilizing someone while the townsfolk entertained themselves with insults, mud, and worse. Again, who locked you in? The executioner. Who came back to let you out? The executioner. It was a glamorous life. And then there were the wheels. Breaking on the wheel was a particularly nasty punishment, where bones were smashed with an iron. Then the victim was tied to a giant wagon wheel and left to die slowly. It was one of the most infamous execution methods. And yes, the executioner had to do it. Sometimes with a crowd cheering, sometimes with grim silence. Either way, he was the one swinging the bar. What makes it even darker is that breaking was sometimes not to kill immediately, but to maim. The wheel became a sort of public art installation of human suffering, and the executioner was both artist and janitor, which, again, shows how weirdly theatrical medieval punishment was. But not every task was gruesome. Some were just weirdly practical. Executioners often had to clean up after battles, deal with corpses, or drag bodies to be displayed. Heads of traitors might be nailed to city gates, and guess who got the job? Not the mayor, that's for sure. The executioner was basically a one-man public works department for all things unpleasant. Sometimes they even had to build the gallows. As if swinging the rope wasn't enough, you also had to be the carpenter. Hammer the wood together, climb, up to test the structure, make sure it wouldn't collapse mid-hanging. Because the only thing worse than a botched execution was a botched stage. And of course there were fires. Burning at the stake was a favorite punishment for heresy or witchcraft. That meant the executioner had to gather wood, stack it neatly, and then light the whole thing while trying not to inhale too much smoke. Basically, a glorified campfire manager, except no one brought marshmallows. It wasn't just about punishments either. Executioners also played roles in ceremonial justice. Sometimes they carried the sword of state in processions. Sometimes they stood as grim symbols during official events. Think of them as the dark mascots of law and order, necessary for the image but not invited to the after-party. And because of all this, executioners became walking reminders of mortality. You saw them at weddings, you saw them at festivals, you saw them at church, always hovering in the background. Not exactly the life of the party. more like the guy who ruins the vibe just by existing. Of course, not every executioner hated these duties. Some leaned into it. Some became minor celebrities. Others found grim satisfaction in their precision. But most, judging by the records, just treated it as a job. A dirty, awkward, unavoidable job. When you piece it all together, you realize how wide their responsibilities actually were. They weren't just executioners. They were butchers, healers, torturers, stage managers, janitors, carpenters, medics, and occasional pig killers. A Swiss army knife of unpleasantness. So when people imagine executioners sitting at home polishing their axes until the next beheading, that's only part of the story. The rest of the time, they were out in the marketplace, branding criminals, leading pigs to the gallows and hammering together scaffolds. Not glamorous, not heroic, just necessary. And as we float forward, let's look at how the profession evolved over time. Because while executioners were always outcasts, their image shifted. In some eras they were feared, in others oddly respected. And eventually, in some countries, they became almost professionalized, like doctors, only with a sword. From outcasts to professionals. So by now we've wandered through the gardens, kitchens, and gallows of medieval executioners. We've seen them feed chickens, raise children, and hang pigs. But let's float forward a bit in time, because the role of the executioner didn't stay static. Like everything else in Europe, it evolved. Not quickly, not gracefully, but in its own awkward way. In the early Middle Ages, executioners were often just whoever was handy. A soldier, a servant, sometimes even the victim's enemy, which made for predictably messy results. If you've ever handed an axe to someone who doesn't know what they're doing, you can imagine how badly that went. Multiple swings, lots of screaming, very bad Yelp reviews. Over time, though, towns realized maybe it's better to have a professional, someone who knows how to do it quickly, someone with experience, and thus the hereditary executioner emerged. Families who inherited the grisly craft passed down like shoemaking, only with more trauma. By the 14th and 15th centuries, executioners were firmly established as a necessary evil. Still despised, still excluded, but recognized as skilled workers. Think of them as the medieval version of plumbers. You don't want to be friends with your plumber, but when the toilet explodes, you're suddenly very glad he exists. Then, by the Renaissance, something started to shift. Cities were getting bigger, punishments were getting more elaborate, and justice was becoming more performative. Public executions were major events, drawing huge crowds. People brought food, kids, even souvenirs. It was the medieval equivalent of Netflix, only bloodier, and at the center of it all was the executioner. Suddenly his skill mattered more than ever. A clean, single-stroke beheading could make the crowd murmur with approval. A botched job, 3 swings and a lot of screaming, could make the crowd riot. Your reputation was literally in your wrist strength, so executioners gained a strange form of professional pride. They practiced, they studied anatomy. Some even lobbied for better tools, sharper swords, sturdier ropes, cleaner scaffolds. Because if they were going to be hated, they at least wanted to be hated as experts. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the image of the executioner was shifting again. In some places they were granted official uniforms, red coats in certain German states, distinctive hats in France, almost like grim civil servants, and in a bizarre twist, some executioners even gained celebrity status. Crowds began to recognize them by name. Their skill became part of urban lore. Ah yes, Meister Franz, cleanest beheader in Nuremberg. Or don't mess with Paris, the Sanson family's in charge. People talked about them the way modern sports fans talk about pitches: efficiency, style, consistency. Only instead of fastballs, it was decapitations. This didn't erase the stigma. Executioners still lived on the margins, still struggled socially, still had awkward kids no one wanted to marry. But professionally, they were rising. More official, more stable, less like random butchers, more like state employees. The Sanson. Family in France is the perfect case study. We already met Charles-Henri, who took off Louis XVI's head. But his ancestors had been quietly doing the same work for over a century. By his time, the family had become established. They were educated, they owned property. They weren't just fringe pariahs anymore. They were part of the machinery of the French state, which is hilarious because while Parisian society might still whisper about their dirty trade, everyone still showed up to watch their work. Executioners were like celebrities you pretend to dislike, but secretly can't stop following. Their medieval guilty pleasure. Meanwhile, in Germany, Meister Franz Schmidt, our diary-writing friend, managed to pull off something extraordinary. After decades of careful, respectful service, he petitioned for, and actually received, a full pardon, which meant he and his descendants were no longer socially stained. That almost never happened. Usually, once your family was stuck in the role, you were doomed forever. But Franz's reputation for dignity and compassion actually broke the cycle. His kids got to become normal people, a rare happy ending in this otherwise gloomy profession. It shows how far the executioner's image had come. From random thugs swinging axes to hereditary pariahs, to skilled professionals who could occasionally win grudging respect. Not quite acceptance, but respect, which in medieval Europe was about as good as it got. By the 18th century, the role was downright professionalized. Executioners were on official payrolls, they kept records, they had apprentices, they trained their sons carefully in technique, and in some cases, they even lectured on anatomy to medical students. Yes, the same man who hanged your uncle might also give a guest talk at the university, because the line between state killer and medical expert was blurry at best. And of course, tools were evolving too. The guillotine in France made execution faster, cleaner, and more predictable, which made the executioner less of an artist with a sword and more of a button pusher. Some even complained about it, ironically, losing their craft to automation centuries before factory workers would feel the same. Ah yes, the guillotine, putting hard-working beheaders out of business since 1792. So when we look at executioners over time, what we see is a slow, awkward climb from despised nobodies to semi-official professionals. Never loved, rarely, welcomed but increasingly essential, and sometimes even respected for their precision. And yet, the stigma never quite went away. Even the most skilled, even the most polite, even the ones who healed the sick, they still carried the mark. Society could not forget their association with death, and maybe that was the point. Executioners were supposed to embody the line between law and violence, to be living reminders that justice had teeth, which meant they were never going to be fully embraced. They were always going to be the strange men in red coats, standing on the scaffold, going home to their gardens after work. And as we drift further, we can look at the twilight years of executioners. The 19th century, when prisons and new ideas about punishment started replacing public death. What happens to a profession when its entire reason for existing begins to vanish? Spoiler, it doesn't go gracefully. But let's ease into that slowly. For now we'll leave our executioners in their awkward Renaissance moment. Professionalized, uniformed, occasionally admired, always shunned. The odd men out, carving cabbages one day and carving criminals the next. The long goodbye, so far. We've seen executioners rise from random thugs to hereditary craftsmen, then wobble into semi-professional state employees with uniforms and reputations. But history doesn't sit still. And by the 19th century, the whole landscape of justice was shifting, which meant the executioner's world was shrinking, slowly but steadily. Let's start with the big picture. For centuries, public execution had been the ultimate crowd pleaser, a mix of morality play, punishment, and cheap entertainment. Towns cleared the square. People traveled miles, vendors sold pies, children got hoisted onto shoulders to see a good hanging. But as Europe industrialized, that vibe started to feel outdated. Crowds were bigger, rowdier, harder to control. Executions sometimes sparked riots or turned criminals into folk heroes. Governments began to wonder, was this still justice or was it just free street theater? Spoiler, it was both. So reformers pushed for punishment to move behind closed doors. Prisons, solitary confinement, hard labor, these became the modern answers to crime. Execution itself wasn't abolished, not yet, but it was moved indoors, away from the public gaze. And when the crowd disappeared, so did half the executioner's role. Without the spectacle, without the stage, he was less performer, more technician. Just a man doing a grim job in a grim room, which frankly was less exciting for everyone. Technology also played its part. In France, the guillotine became standard by the late 18th century, and by the 19th it was everywhere. It didn't require finesse. It didn't require multiple swings. It didn't even require charisma. It was mechanical, predictable, and disturbingly efficient. This meant the executioner was no longer seen as a skilled craftsman. He was just the guy pulling the lever, making sure the blade was oiled, and collecting the pieces afterward. Imagine spending generations perfecting the art of the A. Single clean stroke, only to be replaced by a giant falling knife. Medieval automation at its finest. In some places, the role held on stubbornly. In England, hangings remained public until 1868, drawing massive crowds right up to the end. People packed London streets to see the gallows outside Newgate Prison, treating it like the grim Super Bowl. But once they went private, the executioner became almost invisible. Few names were remembered, and fewer still gained any notoriety. Contrast that with France, where the Sanson dynasty kept working into the 19th century, now operating the guillotine behind prison walls. Their job hadn't vanished, but the glamour, if you could call it that, was gone. No more parades, no more massive audiences, just quiet efficiency. The family name lingered, but the aura faded. By the late 19th century, the whole profession looked increasingly anachronistic. Science was in vogue, medicine was modernizing. Governments liked to think of themselves as rational, enlightened, humane, and nothing said unenlightened quite like a man in a red coat chopping off heads. So new methods appeared. The electric chair in America, the gas chamber later on. The guillotine lingered in France into the 20th century, but by then it was already seen as a macabre curiosity. The role of executioner was dissolving into bureaucratic anonymity. In some places, prison wardens or guards took over the duties. No more hereditary families, no more professional pride. Just another line in a job description. And then there's the irony. As the stigma of the job faded, so did its uniqueness. For centuries, executioners had been marked men, outsiders, shunned, whispered about, sometimes attacked. But by the 20th century, When executions happened in sterile prison chambers, no one even knew the executioner's name. He could be your neighbor, your postman, your cousin, and you'd never know. The pariah finally blended back into society, just in time for the profession itself to vanish. It's worth pausing on how strange that is. In the Middle Ages, executioners were both hated and indispensable. Their families bore the weight of stigma for generations. They lived on the edges of towns, married only within their caste, struggled to live normal lives, all for a job they couldn't escape. And then, within a couple centuries, the entire thing unraveled. The profession that had shaped whole dynasties, defined reputations, and terrified children was suddenly gone. Not with a bang, not with a riot, but with a slow fade into bureaucratic paperwork. Of course, not every country moved at the same pace. Some European states held on to public executions into the early 20th century. Others clung to capital punishment, itself well into the 21st. But the era of the hereditary professional executioner was gone. What had once been a deeply stigmatized, oddly theatrical trade was now absorbed into the faceless machinery of the state. In that sense, executioners were victims of their own success. They professionalized death so thoroughly that eventually they made themselves replaceable. Once punishment no longer needed a human face with a sharp sword, their existence was obsolete. So when we think about medieval executioners, their gardens, their pig trials, their branding irons, their awkward kids, it's worth remembering how quickly history can erase even the most entrenched roles. What once seemed eternal can vanish almost overnight, and yet their ghost lingers. In horror movies, in black hoods, in Halloween costumes, the stereotype lives on, divorced from the real, complicated, awkward men who once had to juggle chickens, neighbors, and state-sanctioned decapitations. Executioners, in the end, became less about reality and more about myth, which, honestly, is probably how most of them would have preferred it. And with that, we've wandered through the full arc of their strange existence, from hated outsiders to professional experts, from celebrity headsmen to anonymous bureaucrats, and finally into cultural memory as little more than shadows with axes. Not exactly a glamorous legacy, but then again it never was. The sleepy reflection. So here we are at the end of the road. We've walked beside the executioner through gardens, kitchens, gallows, and centuries. We've seen him raise pigs, hang pigs, and sometimes even heal the neighbors he wasn't supposed to touch. We've followed him from medieval pariah to Renaissance professional, and finally into the quiet, bureaucratic shadows of the modern state. And now, he's gone. Not entirely gone, of course. Capital punishment still exists in parts of the world. But the old figure we've been talking about, the man with the axe, the sword, or the rope, he belongs to history. What lingers isn't really the reality of his life, but the myth. The black hood, the broad shoulders, the looming silhouette in the torchlight, the faceless figure in paintings, always there but never human. The truth, of course, was much messier. Executioners weren't mysterious giants. They were men with aching backs, rowdy children, dirty boots, and vegetables that needed watering. They were outcasts and bureaucrats, craftsmen and scapegoats, healers and killers. They lived whole lives, strange, lonely, complicated. In between those moments we remember them for, it's almost funny how human their stories turn out to be. We picture them as grim machines, single-minded bringers of death. But instead we find diary entries about cabbage harvests. We find complaints about rent. We find stories of children teased at school, wives baking bread, and executioners nervously double-checking their ropes so the crowd wouldn't laugh at them. They weren't villains, not exactly. They weren't heroes either. They were stuck. Stuck in a job nobody wanted, marked by stigma nobody forgave, carrying out the orders of governments that pretended to despise them, but never once hesitated to use them. If there's one word for the executioner's story, it might be irony. Despised but necessary, feared but needed, hated in life, remembered in costume. Their whole existence was one long balancing act between violence and survival, between law and shame, between the ordinary rhythms of daily life and the extraordinary horror of the scaffold. And yet in a way they remind us that history isn't just kings, queens and battles. It's also the people who had to sweep up afterward, the ones who got stuck with the dirty jobs, the roles no one wanted, the work everyone pretended not to see but couldn't live without. Executioners are part of that hidden backbone of history. They're reminders that civilization has always relied on its outsiders, which makes them strangely relatable. Not because most of us are swinging axes for a living, but because most of us know what it's like to be stuck with the job no one else wants. To carry a label we didn't choose. To be defined by something outside our control. The executioner just had it in the most extreme way possible. As we drift here at the end, let's take one last sleepy walk through his world. Picture a quiet medieval town at dusk. The square is empty. The scaffold looms, but no crowd gathers. Behind the walls at the edge of town, a man in a red coat tends his small patch of vegetables. His children laugh somewhere in the distance, chasing chickens. His wife calls them inside. He sharpens a blade, not because there's a job tomorrow, but because it's habit. Because it's what his father did, and what his son might someday have to do. He doesn't smile much. He doesn't frown either. He just does the work, day after day, year after year. Until finally history leaves him behind, and that's really the story. Executioners weren't monsters and they weren't mysteries. They were just people, woven awkwardly into the machinery of justice, condemned to carry society's violence so no one else had to. Now they're gone. What's left is the echo, in myths, in costumes, in bedtime stories like this. A shadowy figure we half remember, half invent. Strange, necessary, forgotten, and maybe that's the best place for him to stay. So, as we close tonight's long wandering, let your mind drift away from the gallows, away from the noise of the crowd, and into the quiet edges of history where the executioner lived his real life. A life of gardens, families, chickens and chores. Strange, yes. Heavy, yes. But also very human. Shadows that linger so. You thought we were finished. And technically we were. We followed the executioner from his cabbage patch to his scaffold, from medieval pig trials to the guillotine's cold efficiency. We watched him fade into bureaucratic nothingness, swallowed up by prisons and paperwork. But history has a way of leaving little leftovers, strange echoes, quiet shadows. Executioners, for all their stigma, never fully disappeared from the imagination. Even after the role itself dissolved, the idea of the executioner stuck. In folklore, in nursery rhymes, in ghost stories whispered to children who didn't want to go to bed. You can abolish the office, you can dismantle the scaffold, but you can't erase the silhouette of a hooded man with an axe. That image lingers. Why? Probably because executioners embodied something deeper. They were human symbols of fear, living reminders that punishment wasn't abstract, that justice had hands, and that those hands were not clean. When societies moved on, they didn't need the men anymore. but they kept the shadows. Think about it. In literature, the executioner became stock character number one. The silent figure in the background, a man in black waiting at the edge of the king's court. A looming presence in Shakespeare, Dickens, and every Gothic tale worth its salt. He barely needed dialogue. Just being there was enough to unsettle. And in art, executioners got exaggerated. Big muscles, massive hoods, weapons the size of tree, trunks. The real executioners of history, the ones with bad knees and families to feed, wouldn't even recognize themselves in those depictions. But the myth was more useful than the truth. Societies remembered the monster, not the man, which is ironic. Because if we learned anything wandering through their lives, it's that executioners weren't monsters at all. They were ordinary people stuck in extraordinary roles. They chopped wood, drank ale, healed neighbors, and worried about bills. The hood and the axe, that was only one part of their week. But it's the only part we chose to remember. And maybe that's why they're so fascinating. Executioners sit at the blurry line between myth and history, too mundane to be legends, too grim to be forgotten. They occupy the same mental space as witches, alchemists, and grave diggers, jobs that were real, necessary, and ordinary, but remembered as strange, sinister, and symbolic. That's the gift and curse of being an executioner. Your actual life disappears. The myths take over. The man with chickens in his yard fades, and the man with the axe survives. Not fair, but very human. There's also something almost comforting about it. The fact that history chose to smooth out the rough edges, to turn executioners into shadows instead of people. It's easier to sleep at night thinking of the hooded figure than of the man worrying about feeding his children. Easier to believe in the myth than to confront the reality that justice required ordinary men to carry extraordinary burdens. So maybe the persistence of the myth says more about us than about them. We don't want to remember the executioner as human. We want him to be the faceless shadow, the necessary villain in a play, because the alternative, that he was just a man doing his job, is too close to home. And with that thought, let's let him drift back into the mist. Not the man in the cabbage patch, not the diary writer, not the hereditary craftsman, but the shadow, the hooded figure we imagine when we hear the word executioner, the one standing at the scaffold in the twilight, waiting, silent, patient. He doesn't need to move anymore. History has moved on. He lingers only as an idea, and maybe that's exactly how he would have wanted it. So this is the real end now. Not with another hanging or another pig trial, but with a shadow that lingers at the edge of the firelight. A reminder of all the dirty work history hides. If you're still awake and unlikely, let your thoughts soften, let the shadow fade, and let sleep finally take the place of executioners, scaffolds, and crowds. Because in the end, the only place the executioner lives now is in our stories, and tonight we've given him one more. Executioners in folklore, so the real executioners faded away. The scaffolds came down, the gallows rotted, the guillotines got shoved into museum basements. But in people's imaginations, executioners never really left. Folklore clung to them. Ballads, nursery rhymes, whispered legends, all carrying the shadow of the man with the axe. And of course these stories were less about reality, more about exaggeration. Because nothing makes a better bedtime tale than a faceless figure with a very sharp blade. Take old German folk tales, for example. Executioners often pop up as ominous figures on lonely roads. The kind of man you meet in a story just before something goes wrong. Sometimes he's a punisher, sometimes he's a ghost, sometimes he's both. The real man with aching knees and a cabbage garden, forgotten. But the shadow, eternal. In English folklore, executioners sometimes appear in cautionary tales told to children. Behave, or the headsman will come for you. Not exactly uplifting, but then again neither were most medieval lullabies. People used executioners the way we use the bogeyman, a figure to embody fear, discipline, and the consequences of bad behavior. Ghost stories loved them too. Executioners became restless spirits in castles, pacing the battlements with dripping axes, forever searching for their next victim. Tour guides still love to point out the executioner's tower, or the executioner's room in old castles, as if the poor man spent his life lurking dramatically in the shadows. In reality, he was probably just at home arguing with his wife about chicken feed. But in legend, he's always there, lurking, waiting, silent. Even in songs and rhymes, little echoes of executioners linger. The old nursery rhyme, Oranges and Lemons, ends with the cheerful line, "Here comes a chopper to chop off your head." Very soothing for children. Medieval parents clearly had a different idea of bedtime vibes. And think about fairy tales. How many of them casually include a headsman? Snow White's stepmother doesn't just want her gone, she specifically orders the huntsman to cut out her heart. The idea of a man with a blade waiting in the wings was so normalized that it became background noise in stories. A stock character you didn't need to explain. And then there's the strange twist. Sometimes executioners were cast not as villains, but as figures of dark justice. The man who makes sure the wicked get their due, a necessary shadow keeping balance in the world. That duality, monster or servant of justice, gave them a permanent place in folklore. They could play either role depending on the mood of the story. It's fascinating, isn't it? The real executioner struggled for acceptance, lived on. The margins carried stigma for generations. But the mythical executioner, he was everywhere, in songs, in rhymes, in ghost stories, in plays. Parents terrified children with him. Writers used him as shorthand for dread. Artists painted him larger than life. The man faded. The shadow thrived. So if you visit an old European town today, and the guide points to a crooked tower and says, "That's where the executioner lived," you'll probably feel a shiver. Not because of who he really was, but because of who we turned him into. A faceless figure in folklore, a bogeyman in bedtime stories, a reminder of justice with an edge, and maybe that's the most lasting punishment the executioner ever received. History took away his humanity and left him only as a shadow. Executioners in pop culture. So executioners may have lost their jobs sometime in the 19th century, but try telling that to pop culture. If anything, modern media fell in love with them. The faceless man in the black hood became a stock character in films, books, cartoons, and even Halloween decorations. It's honestly funny, because the hood itself wasn't really a historical thing. Medieval executioners didn't usually wear masks. Why bother? Everyone already knew who they were. You couldn't exactly keep your profession a secret when you lived in the executioner's house outside the city walls, but pop culture decided, no, let's give him a hood, make him anonymous, make him spooky. And thus, the executioner, we see in movies, hulking, silent, terrifying, is about 90% Hollywood invention, 10% reality. Think of old films like The Adventures of Robin Hood or even Monty Python skits. The executioner is always this looming figure with a huge axe, swinging it around like he's auditioning for professional wrestling. In reality, the guy was probably muttering about his aching back and sharpening his blade with quiet concentration. Cartoons had fun with it too. Bugs Bunny, Tom and Jerry, Someone always ends up in a medieval dungeon with an executioner warming up the axe. Always the hood, always the big muscles, always the comic timing. Pop culture boiled centuries of stigma into a single instantly recognizable symbol: the hooded man with the blade. Even video games love them. Every time you stumble into a fantasy RPG, you'll find one. He's either guarding a dungeon, swinging an absurdly oversized axe, or being treated as some kind of mini-boss. Again, more about vibes than history. So the real executioner disappears, but the fictional one, he's immortal, a meme basically. The hooded headsman is to medieval history what cowboys are to the American West. Mostly invented, endlessly, recycled. Part 11, The Afterlife of the Executioner. Now let's drift away from movies and just sit with the strangeness of this. Executioners began as social outcasts. Men who were paid to do the dirty work nobody else wanted. They couldn't join guilds. They couldn't sit with polite society. People feared them, avoided them, whispered about them, and yet, centuries later, they are one of the most enduring symbols of the medieval world. Ask a random person what comes to mind when they hear Middle Ages, and chances are they'll say knights, castles, and executioners. It's ironic, isn't it? The kings, queens, and nobles who ordered executions are mostly remembered in footnotes. But the poor guy carrying out the sentence, he became a cultural icon, a shadow larger than life. In a way, this was his final execution. He lost his identity. History beheaded him, metaphorically. Stripped away the man, left only the role. So the afterlife of the executioner is a ghostly one, not as a person, but as a symbol, forever looming, forever misunderstood, forever anonymous under that invented hood. Part 12, A Gentle Farewell and... With that, let's drift slowly to the end. We've followed the executioner from his busy work on the scaffold, through his awkward daily life, into his strange social role, his decline, his folklore shadow, and his rebirth in movies and myths. What's left is quiet. Just the reminder that history isn't only kings and queens or great battles and inventions. It's also the people who stood in the margins, carrying stigma, doing jobs no one else wanted. People like the executioner. So next time you see a hooded figure in a cartoon, or pass by a tourist executioner's house, you'll know there was once a real man there. Maybe tired, maybe lonely, maybe just trying to sell vegetables at the market without being spat on. Not a monster, not a legend, just a man stuck between society's fear and its need for justice. And now, his story has become your bedtime story. A slow, strange, oddly human tale of shadows, cabbage patches, and centuries of reputation. So dim the lights a little lower. Close your eyes. Let the image of the hooded man fade. He's not swinging an axe anymore. He's just walking quietly. Into history, finally off duty. Executioners in pop culture, hey again, you're still here. That means you didn't wander off to sleep yet. Or maybe you're half asleep with your headphones still in. Either way, let's keep floating. We've talked about executioners as real people, trapped in stigma, tending their gardens, running, side hustles. But now it's time to look at the fictional executioner, the one that survived way longer than any real one ever did, the one who slipped out of history and somehow became a pop culture celebrity. Because if you've noticed, executioners don't really go away. You don't run into, say, medieval tanners in Hollywood movies, or 14th century shoemakers, but the hooded man with the axe, he keeps showing up everywhere. The birth of the hood first things first. The hood. You know the look. Black, Cloth bag, eye holes cut out, maybe a leather strap. Very menacing, very dramatic, and completely made up. Yep, there's little to no evidence that medieval executioners wore hoods at all. Why would they? Everyone knew who they were. You couldn't exactly stroll into town, decapitate someone, and then pretend it was a mystery. Who did it? Medieval cities weren't that big. People recognized faces, names, and families. If anything, hiding would have been suspicious. Imagine your town executioner showing up in a full disguise every time he worked. People would whisper, "Okay, but why is Lars suddenly wearing a sack on his head? We know it's him. He's the only guy in town licensed to do this." So where did the hood come from? Blame art, theatre, and later cinema. And as soon as people started telling stories about executioners rather than employing them, the costume got exaggerated. A hood was useful. It made the figure anonymous. It made him scary. It turned him into a role, not a man, which honestly was already happening in folklore. Executioners on stage by the 17th and 18th centuries, when public executions were still happening but were becoming more about the show than the justice, dramatizations started to creep in. Stage plays loved the image of the masked executioner. Shakespeare himself didn't use the hood. His plays mention executioners, but they're just men with swords. But later playwrights, particularly in France and Germany, really leaned into the anonymous headsman vibe. It gave audiences something to shiver at. The executioner as a faceless figure of fate. Not a tired employee, not a guy with taxes to pay. Just death personified, with a big axe. Executioners in literature fast forward to the 19th century. By now, executions were fading out in many European countries. The guillotine had replaced the axe in France, and England had abolished public executions by the 1860s. But the idea of the executioner stuck around. Romantic and Gothic writers loved him. Victor Hugo, in The Last Day of a Condemned Man, spends pages reflecting on the psychological terror of waiting for the executioner. Charles Dickens, of course, couldn't resist tossing in imagery of gallows and hangmen whenever he needed a dark Victorian vibe. By this point, the executioner had left reality behind and stepped firmly into the imagination. He was less about the man, more about the mood, a prop, a symbol. Hollywood gets involved. Now let's jump into the 20th century. Movies arrive. And honestly, directors wasted no time recycling the executioner as a visual cliché. Think of those early Robin Hood films. Somewhere in the background, there's always a dungeon, always a scaffold, and always, without fail, a massive guy in a hood sharpening his axe. He doesn't even need dialogue. He's there to be the atmosphere. Comedy got in on it too. Monty Python's sketches parodied execution scenes, complete with ridiculous executioners who looked like they were about to pass out from heat stroke under those heavy hoods. The gag worked because everyone already recognized the stereotype. You didn't need to explain who the hooded guy was. Audiences instantly got it, and then cartoons ran wild with it. Bugs Bunny facing a goofy executioner, Tom and Jerry dangling above a chopping block. Even Disney slipped him in occasionally as a background threat in medieval-themed animations. He was so instantly recognizable that even kids knew. Hooded. Man, big axe, danger. Video games and the boss fight executioner. And then, of course, came video games. By the time RPGs became mainstream in the 80s and 90s, the executioner had fully evolved into an archetype. He wasn't just a guy anymore. He was practically a level boss. Dark Souls, Assassin's Creed, Skyrim, you name it somewhere. In there lurks a hulking figure with a hood and a comically oversized axe. Sometimes he's guarding a dungeon. Sometimes he's enforcing justice. Sometimes he's just there to look scary before you whack him with a magic sword. But the irony is, these games often make him too powerful. The real executioner wasn't a warrior. He wasn't swinging his axe all day like a blacksmith lifting weights. Most of them were ordinary guys, often in mediocre health. But video games need villains, not tired gardeners. So the pop culture, executioner gets a gym membership, bulging muscles, and a dramatic backstory. Halloween and the executioner costume, and of course, let's not forget Halloween. At some point, someone decided the executioner makes a great costume. It's got everything: scary hood, big prop weapon, medieval vibes. No need for realism. Nobody dresses up as Wilhelm the Town Executioner, who also sells onions. No. You dress up as the 7-foot silent hooded boogeyman version. It's easy, it's effective, and it shows just how far the executioner has traveled from reality. He's become a cartoon, a seasonal decoration, a meme. The irony of it all. So here's the irony. The real executioner spent centuries trying to be less visible. He lived on the edge of town, kept a low profile, and was often shunned by his neighbors. But the fictional executioner? He's everywhere. You can't escape him. He's in cartoons, in games, in costumes, in jokes, in nursery rhymes. He became bigger than the kings and queens he once served. Nobody dresses up as Henry VIII's tax collector, but plenty of people dress up as Henry's executioner. History reduced him to a caricature, and then culture turned that caricature into an icon. The afterlife of the executioner. Here's the strange thing about history. Some people work their entire lives to be remembered, and then they vanish. Their names barely survive in a footnote. Others never asked for fame, never wanted a spotlight, but end up being remembered forever. The medieval executioner is one of those, because once the execution stopped, once the tools were put away, and the men themselves faded into obscurity, the image lived on, not as a man, but as a shadow. The forgotten man, if you were to walk through a medieval town in, say, the year 1400 and ask, "Who's your executioner?" Those people could tell you. He was part of the community, even if at the margins. His name would be known, whispered with distaste, or muttered in caution. He was unavoidable. But ask that same question today, centuries later, and most people couldn't. Name a single real executioner. Their identities have melted into the background. There's no celebrity executioner remembered the way we remember kings, queens, generals, or poets. Sure, a handful stand out. The Sanson family in France, who worked the guillotine for 6 generations, became minor celebrities of horror. But they're the exception. Most executioners left no legacy at all except in archives and town records. Their humanity has been forgotten, so in one sense, they lost. They spent lives being judged, stigmatized, avoided, and then even their names disappeared. The surviving image, but in another sense they won, or at least their role did. Because the image of the executioner outlived almost everyone else. Kings die, queens fade, nobles become trivia questions. But the executioner, he's still here, still looming in the imagination. The man disappeared. The role survived. When you picture medieval Europe, the mental slideshow usually goes castles, knights, peasants, plague doctors, and then, somewhere in there, the executioner. Even if you know nothing else, you know him. The hood, the axe, the chopping block. It's almost a cliché at this point. It's strange, isn't it? The people who ordered the executions, the judges, the rulers, the bishops, they're often forgotten. The man who simply carried it out, is remembered as the symbol of justice, punishment and death. History kind of handed him the spotlight by accident. The executioner as archetype, there's a word for this. Archetype. An archetype isn't a person. It's a role, a symbol, a recurring figure that shows up over and over in stories. And the executioner, whether we like it or not, became one. Not a farmer, not a merchant, not a baker. Nobody tells endless stories about a medieval cheesemaker. But the executioner crossed over into mythology. He became, in a sense, death's assistant, a physical stand-in for fate, the man who doesn't decide the sentence but delivers it anyway. A reminder that human life can end with a single swing of an axe, and once you become an archetype, you don't die. You just keep showing up, in ghost stories, in nursery rhymes, in Halloween costumes. You can't bury an archetype. The social punishment that lasted forever. And here's the real irony. Executioners were punished in life by social stigma. They were outsiders. People wouldn't marry them, wouldn't dine with them, wouldn't trade with them. It was a life sentence of isolation, passed down through generations. And now, centuries later, their memory suffers the same fate. The real men are forgotten. The myth, the mask, the hood, and that's what remains. They're still denied humanity, still denied a place among normal people in history, so their punishment never really ended. Society shunned them in life, and then shunned their names in memory. What survived was only the caricature, a curious kind of immortality. But if you think about it another way, maybe this is its own kind of immortality. The medieval executioner might not have wanted to be remembered, but he was, just not as himself. Instead, he was transformed into something larger, a permanent character in the human imagination, a bogeyman, a shadow in the corner of every medieval story, a faceless man whose presence lingers wherever the Middle Ages are invoked. That's a strange legacy. Not fame, not honor, not respect, but immortality nonetheless. The contrast with other professions, it also makes you wonder about other professions. How many other medieval jobs are instantly recognizable today? Knights, of course, maybe monks, maybe jesters, thanks to cartoons. But after that, not many. Nobody can instantly picture a medieval potter, or a tanner, or even a merchant, but an executioner, instantly clear. The image is locked in. We all know it, so the irony deepens. The very job that isolated men from their neighbors gave them eternal presence in the world's imagination. They were despised by their own towns, but they outlived those towns in memory. The executioner's tower, and this is why when you tour an old European town today, there's almost always some executioner's tower, or executioner's house pointed out by the guide. It may or may not even be accurate. Sometimes the town didn't actually preserve those sites, but tourists expect it. The archetype demands it. The executioner has become part of the marketing of the medieval world, a selling point. Here's the castle, here's the dungeon, here's where the executioner lived. The man who once struggled to be accepted in life is now a permanent feature of historical tourism, a photo opportunity, a curiosity. His shadow has more social acceptance now than he ever did alive. The strange duality. So, the afterlife of the executioner is a dual one. On one hand, he's immortalized as a shadowy archetype, endlessly recycled in folklore and pop culture. On the other, his real identity, his humanity, is erased. He lives forever, but not as himself, only as a mask. And maybe that's the strangest fate of all. Not damnation, not salvation, just reduction. A man turned into a symbol, stripped of individuality, forever trapped in a hood that wasn't even real. So as we drift further into this story, the executioner stands as a reminder of how history treats people. Some vanish entirely, some become myths, and sometimes the myth has nothing to do with the man who once walked, worried, and weeded his garden outside the city walls. The afterlife of the executioner is not peace, it's not torment, it's just shadow. A gentle farewell, hey guys. If you've made it all the way here, then you've spent a very long time wandering with me through the shadows of the medieval executioner's life. Maybe you're still awake, maybe you're drifting. Either way, let's wind this down. Looking back, we started with a simple question. What did executioners do when they weren't executing? And the answer was a lot. They worked as healers, as butchers, as garbage men, street cleaners, animal skinners, even low-rent veterinarians. They sold herbs, ran gardens, cut firewood, fixed fences. They lived in houses on the edges of town, close enough to be useful, far enough to be avoided. They lived entire lives in the cracks of society, not honored, not fully hated, just tolerated, barely. And from there we drifted through their side jobs, their reputations, their social struggles. We watched their profession decline, fade into obscurity, and then reappear in folklore, ghost stories, and eventually movies. The man vanished, the mask survived. The human side, it's easy to forget, with all the legends and caricatures, that executioners were people. Ordinary, flawed, tired people. They got hungry, they worried about money, they argued with their families. They had bad backs, sore knees, and probably the same gripes about weather as anyone else. They weren't monsters, no matter how badly society wanted them to be. They weren't heroes either. They were just people doing a job that most of us couldn't imagine doing. And when the job was done, when the scaffold was empty, they went home. They fed their chickens, they pulled weeds, they tried to sleep. The strange legacy, but history rarely remembers people for their humanity. It remembers them for their roles. So the executioner didn't get to keep his individuality. He didn't get to be remembered as Hans or Pierre or Wilhelm. He became a hood, an axe, a faceless figure standing in for fear. That's his strange afterlife. Not peace, not damnation, just reduction. A man boiled down to a symbol, a life condensed into a shadow. And yet that shadow lingers. In tourist brochures, in Halloween costumes, in video games, in ghost stories whispered on castle tours. The executioner lives on in ways he probably never wanted. A quiet drift. So as we close, maybe it's worth holding on to a softer image of him. Not the hooded monster of cartoons, not the villain of folklore, just the man. Picture him walking home, on a grey evening, carrying his tools in silence. Picture him stopping at the market for bread while people look away. Picture him sitting at his table eating slowly, while the world pretends not to see him. That's the real executioner. Quiet, human, forgettable, and maybe, in some way, that's more haunting than the hooded legend. A final whisper so tonight. As you drift into sleep, let the shadow of the executioner fade. Don't see the hood. Don't hear the axe. Just imagine the silence after the crowd has gone home, the empty scaffold, the tools put away, the man alone in his garden, pulling weeds in the fading light. He's not waiting for you. He's not chasing you. He's just tired. And now, finally, off duty, shadows and silence. So here we are. We've walked through centuries of scaffolds and side jobs, cabbage gardens and ghost stories. We've peeled back the hood and found a man. And yet, the story doesn't quite end, does it? Because history never really ends. It lingers. Executioners are gone. Their profession has disappeared. But the idea of them, that remains. It sits somewhere deep in the human imagination, right next to knights in shining armor and monks in cold stone cloisters. The Middle Ages, at least in our cultural memory, will always come bundled with a hooded man and an axe. The shape of fear, it makes you wonder. Why did the executioner stick around in our stories when so many other medieval figures did not? Part of it is fear. Humans like to keep a shape for their fears. Fear of death, fear of punishment, fear of justice with no escape. All of that. Is easier to carry if you can picture it. And the executioner, faceless and silent, gave fear a body. We don't need to picture a judge in robes. We don't need to imagine a royal decree. We just imagine the man with the axe. And suddenly the whole machinery of justice feels real. The comfort of symbols, and maybe that's also comforting. Symbols are easier than people. People are messy, complicated, unpredictable. A real executioner might have been nervous, clumsy, maybe even regretful. That's harder to process. A hooded figure with an axe. Simpler, cleaner, easier. So society kept the symbol and let the man vanish. It was tidier that way. History's quiet jokes. History has a sense of irony. Not the loud laugh out loud kind. More like the quiet chuckle you hear when you realize how things turned out. The executioner wanted to be left alone. He got that in life through avoidance, and he got it again in memory through erasure. He didn't want fame, but he got immortality, just not as himself. And in a strange way, that's funny. Darkly funny, sure, but funny. A man shunned in life, forgotten in name, remembered forever as a cartoon. History has a way of playing jokes like that, drifting out, so let's leave him here, where he belongs. Half in history, half in imagination. Not a hero, not a villain, just a figure, a shadow. The scaffold is empty now, the crowd has gone home, the axe is put away, and the executioner, whoever he was, is finally allowed to rest. And maybe that's the best ending he could get. Not fame, not glory, not forgiveness, just silence. Forgotten professions. So, we've spent hours with the executioner, but he wasn't the only medieval professional to disappear into history's cracks. The Middle Ages were full of jobs that made perfect sense then, and feel utterly strange now. We like to imagine the past as knights, queens, and maybe the occasional peasant with a pitchfork. But real medieval society was full of specialists, and many of them would look just as odd to us today as the hooded man with the axe. The leech collector, for example. There were leech collectors. Yes, exactly what it sounds like. Men and women wading into swamps and rivers, letting little blood-sucking worms attach themselves to bare skin, then carefully peeling them off and tossing them into buckets. These leeches weren't for fun of course, they were medicine, or at least what passed for medicine at the time. Bloodletting was the miracle cure of the age. Got a fever, cut a vein, headache, apply a leech, feeling tired. Yep, leech it out. So leech collectors were busy, respected in their way, and always itchy. Imagine coming home from a day's work covered in tiny bite marks. The job was messy, thankless, and absolutely essential, until it wasn't. And like the executioner, they vanished. Medicine moved on, and suddenly no one needed someone to go fishing for worms with their bare legs. The gong farmer, then there, were gong farmers, which sounds kind of noble, like someone tending gongs in a monastery. Spoiler, it was not that. A gong farmer was a medieval euphemism for the guy who cleaned out cesspits. Human waste piled up in medieval cities, because of course it did, and someone had to shovel it out, usually at night. It was a filthy job, and the stench never quite washed away. People avoided gong farmers almost as much as they avoided executioners. And yet, without them, cities would have been unlivable. So once again essential and despised. You can see the pattern. The rat catcher, we also had rat catchers. Part public service, part pest control, part walking plague risk. Cities teemed with rats, and someone had to deal with them. Some rat catchers trained ferrets, others used poison, and a few claimed magical charms that supposedly made rodents obedient. Spoiler again, they didn't. Rat catchers, like executioners, carried this aura of half respect, half revulsion. People wanted them around, but not too close. The vanishing. Act, and just like that, these professions disappeared, or at least changed beyond recognition. We still have waste collectors, exterminators, even blood specialists, but the medieval flavor is gone. The raw strangeness of those roles faded away, leaving only a faint memory. Executioners, gong farmers, leech collectors, all of them got folded into modern society in subtler ways. But the original jobs? Extinct. A small joke from time. It's funny when you think about it. A medieval child might have dreamed of growing up to be a knight or a princess, but statistically, they were more likely to end up cleaning cesspits or hauling leeches. History once again has its own quiet sense of humor. The glamorous figures are the ones we remember, but the real glue holding medieval life together? It was the weird, dirty, and uncomfortable jobs no one wanted. Justice, mercy, and the long shadow of punishment. So let's set the scene again, medieval justice. It wasn't exactly subtle. If you stole a loaf of bread, there wasn't much discussion about community service. There was a fine, or stocks. Or if someone was feeling dramatic, a hanging punishment was public. Always public. Because it wasn't just about you. It was about everyone else watching. The spectacle mattered. Justice as theatre. That's really what punishment was back then. Theatre. A morality play acted out in the marketplace. You'd see. The condemned brought forward, hear a priest give a final sermon, and then the executioner would do his work. People weren't there just for blood, though let's be honest, some were. They were there to see justice, to be reminded what happened if you crossed the line. In a world without TV or newspapers, this was the medieval version of a PSA. A grim little advertisement for good behavior. Mercy, sort of now. Did mercy exist? Yes, kind of. Medieval rulers loved the idea of mercy. It made them look noble. But mercy was never just, "Oh, you're forgiven, go home." It was more like, "We'll let you live, but you'll lose a hand." Or, instead of hanging, "You'll serve in the army?" So merciful. But in the way a cat is merciful when it only half kills the mouse. Sometimes a criminal could even beg for benefit of clergy. If you could read a Bible verse out loud, you were considered a churchman and spared execution. This loophole turned literacy into a literal lifesaver. A thief who could stammer out a psalm might walk free. So yes, mercy was there, but it had strings, shame as a weapon, and then there was shame. Medieval society loved shaming punishments, pillories, stocks, public whippings. You didn't just suffer physically, you suffered socially. Imagine being locked in a wooden frame in the middle of town square while your neighbors threw rotten cabbages at you. That wasn't just about punishment. That was about turning you into a living cautionary. Tailed execution was the ultimate punishment, yes, but the everyday machinery of justice ran more on shame than on death. Most people didn't hang. Most people just stood in the cold while their neighbors laughed. The executioner's place. Where does our executioner fit in here? He was the last act of the play, the final option, the nuclear button. Most crimes didn't reach him. He was called when society wanted a clean break. When shame and fines and floggings weren't enough, then, and only then, did the hooded man come out. That gave him a strange power. He wasn't needed often, but when he was, everyone noticed. And everyone pretended they didn't know. Him the next day. Mercy's quiet edge. It's worth noting that executioners were sometimes messengers of mercy too. A quick, clean blow with the sword could be considered merciful compared to a slow hanging. Of course, a quick and clean depended on the executioner's skill and the size of the condemned's neck, but the idea was there. Even in death, there were degrees of kindness, and society clung to that because it let them feel civilized. Yes, we killed him, but nicely. A very medieval way of balancing brutality with self-image, drifting towards silence. So justice and mercy in the Middle Ages weren't about fairness. They were about symbolism, about theatre, shame and authority. The executioner was the shadow, behind the stage curtain. He was the reminder that, at the end of all the rituals and loopholes, the axe was still waiting. And maybe that's why he stayed in people's minds. Because he wasn't just a man. He was the silence at the end of the play. Ghosts of the scaffold. You'd think that once the axe came down, that was the end of it. The body is gone, the crowd drifts home, the executioner cleans his blade, and life just continues. But it didn't. Not really. Because medieval people were experts at remembering things badly. Haunted places. Many places that hosted executions were thought to be permanently cursed. Gallows hills were avoided. Children were warned not to play there. Even shepherds didn't let their flocks graze too close. People swore they saw glowing lights at night, heard whispering voices in the wind. It wasn't unusual to leave offerings, bread, coins, even a splash of ale, at the base of an old scaffold, just in case some restless soul was still hanging around. It was a kind of folklore recycling. The body was gone, but the fear stayed. Ghostly. Guests, 6 executed criminals, were believed to become particularly aggressive ghosts, not noble, tragic spirits, just angry, petty ones. Taverns near execution sites reported phantom drinkers who knocked mugs off shelves. Inns spoke of guests who vanished into mist at sunrise. If something went wrong in a village, the locals often blamed one of the hanged, rather than admitting they simply left the butter out too long. Even the executioners weren't immune. Some complained of being followed home at night by shadows, or waking to hear their name whispered in the dark. They didn't exactly get to file an HR complaint about it. Curses and last words, and then there were the curses. Medieval people put serious stock in a condemned person's final words. A curse shouted at the crowd could haunt an entire village for decades. If a noble died on the block and muttered something ominous like, "You'll follow me soon," the court might panic for weeks. Sometimes they'd even dig up the body later and rebury it with charms or iron nails in the coffin, just to be safe. Because apparently, the Middle Ages were 50% politics, 50% trying not to get cursed. The executioner's quiet role. The executioner sometimes acted as an unofficial exorcist. After the job was done, he might burn the rope or bury the axe head, believing it would lock the spirit down. Some even wore charms under their clothes to protect themselves from the souls they'd sent off. It's strangely human, isn't it? They performed this cold, legal duty, then quietly lit a candle so the ghost wouldn't be mad at them. Memory. Over flesh, and that's how executions lived on, not just in bodies but in minds. They seeped into folklore, into tavern tales, lullabies, and the spaces people walked around but never through. The executioner's work was over in minutes. The fear he stirred lasted centuries,